It's interesting. The countries that are really accusing China of being a new colonial force or a new imperialist force are the very countries that actually were colonizers and actually imperialist forces. So that we always should hold with a little bit of suspicion, but they do have the dominance over the kind of global narrative, right? But one of the things I think fundamentally China emerges as a country of the third world, of Latin America, Asia, and Africa, of the colonized world, and never grew even in when we see this rise of China never grew out of the same way that the Western societies, which is hundreds of years of colonialism, genocide, and slavery, and territorial invasion of other countries. That is just historically untrue. So there's that as the basis from which China emerges. And I think this is also why we are seeing a stronger and stronger sort of affirmations. And we saw this at the BRICS Plus Summit in Johannesburg just recently, where President Xi Jinping was reaffirming very much that China is of the global south, comes from the global south, and will always be part of the global south as its historical trajectory, right? Even if it is now, depending if you use purchasing power parity or not, already either the first or the second largest economy. That's a historical understanding of where China comes from, and I think it informs a lot of its foreign policy today. Of course, China's foreign policy is very much, around this idea of the non-interference, the principles of peaceful coexistence that comes out of the Bandung moment in the 1950s and really solidifies as part of China's foreign policy. But I don't want this to mean that China doesn't act or is somehow passive and just sits by and lets things happen. Certainly, to me, it's quite bizarre, this idea of China as being aggressor, trying to become a militaristic power or invading, because that's just not the history. We haven't really fought a hot war in 40 years or something like that. And the track record of every Western country or any NATO country or G7 country speaks for itself, who actually engages and starts wars. But what I think China's foreign policy today is important, especially for the global south, it is using its capacity now as a strong country to build new multilateral and regional platforms. And that's really, I think, where China is acting and not, and you can say that's interference or non-interference, but it is something that is creating opportunities for global south countries that have been just historically excluded from the decision-making tables, while being on the receiving end of unfavorable policies, unfavorable structural adjustment programs, and everything that we've seen after our so-called independence in the neoliberal era. And so we're seeing things, BRICS, and I know a lot of people on the left have suspicions because it's not a left enough project, it's not an anti-imperialist project, but it is a project that now represents, over 40% of the world population and nearly the same amount of the global GDP and production. This is not a kind of alliance or grouping that we can omit or ignore, Maybe it's not the anti-imperialist front it is, but it's a platform for countries to actually think about, how to get out of the stranglehold of the dollar hegemony, how to find a pathway where we can actually, get financing or trade, even just in our own currencies. That's absurd to think that that's not possible in our current framework. But that's part of anti-imperialism today. That's actually part of a non-militaristic solution to think about how countries can actually be more sovereign and have a bit more say in their own path forward. But we're also seeing other things, BRI now celebrating its 10-year anniversary, the Belt and Road Initiative has been an important possibility, option for global south countries to get financing, get bridges, get ports, get airports, the basic things that global south countries are needing. And I think a lot of the West like to smear this because, first of all, I don't think they have any capacity to build anything and actually compete with China in actually delivering anything. We've heard many acronyms, the Build Back Better World and the PGII, and every year it's a new thing, but nothing gets built ever. So you have to smear it, and say this is a colonial force. But when you ask the countries themselves and the leaders themselves that are choosing this option, they're saying, okay, the West has failed to provide us any meaningful options, and we are going with China. And there's this enduring colonial mentality, paternalism, to say, global south countries can't choose a different path, and a path that China is helping to pave. So anyways, I could go on, but I think that's an important part to understand China's relationship or kind of foreign policy that sometimes, I guess, this gets dismissed as only about trade or only about development. when you talk to global South countries, that's not an only, that's a priority, that's strategic, and that's a fundamental thing in order to actually achieve any kind of national sovereignty and dignity for the people.